The views and opinions expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of Natural Bridges Media or KSQD's staff, volunteers, or underwriters.
Hello and welcome to Talk of the Bay. I'm your host, Len B.A., and I am pleased to have as my guest Amy Chen-Mills. Amy Chen-Mills recently ran for county supervisor in District 3. She's a mental health professional who has written 3 books, including The Spark Inside for teens and State of Mind in the Classroom for educators. For 10 years, she directed the national nonprofit Center for Sustainable Change. She has also been an investigative journalist and essayist who started her writing career here in Santa Cruz. She teaches and counsels people through a spiritual psychology variously called Health Realization, Innate Health, and 3 Principles. Amy is a climate and social justice activist, an educator, and a global speaker and trainer on matters of emotional, spiritual, and physical resilience, especially during our current, very challenging times. Amy is a mother of 2 teens. She's been a radio show host here at KSQD, a lead trainer for Santa Clara County, and has her own YouTube channel. You can reach her at her website at www.amychen.com. That's AMICHEN. Amy Chen-Mills, welcome.
Thank you so much, Len. Thank you for having me on the show.
It's a pleasure. You recently ran for office, but you came out of an atmosphere of working steadily, particularly on climate issues and on mental health issues, and since you were motivated by your activism, much of your campaign focused on climate change and related issues, and mental health services, which arguably is also related to climate change.
Yeah.
And in the process, you got a big education in county policies and governance. We all hear about county land use policies, their efforts to address homelessness when they happen, and especially since COVID, about public health services. What are some of the other issues that fall under the purview of county government that you encountered in the process of building up to and running your campaign?
Well, a lot of people aren't terribly familiar with county governance and what the Board of Supervisors does. It's a little bit of a sleeper for a lot of folks. And yet the county budget is now over $1 billion. And our county in particular has a lot of residents who are governed by the county government. So all the people who live in the unincorporated areas, which is most of the Live Oak area, including Soquel and the Soquel Forest area where people live, and in District 3 in Bonnie Doon, and up through Davenport in the North Coast. All these people are governed by the county, and then going down south, and throughout the central county, you've got the San Lorenzo Valley area. You've got any place that doesn't have a city government is governed by the county, right? So big parts of Paro Valley as well. So it's a big job, actually, and it's one of our biggest issues as a county is that we don't get the same level of funding per capita that other counties get in order to maintain and govern this whole big area with all these residents. So one of my biggest learning curves was around fire issues. We all are very concerned about fires now, and fires are directly related to the climate crisis that we are currently in the midst of. And we all know that we lost something like 920 homes in the CZU complex fires of 2020. So people in Bonnie Doon, people in Davenport are all reeling from the devastation of these fires. And I don't know if I mentioned Last Chance. Last Chance, of course, is part of District 3 as well.
Right.
And our capacity to be able to fight fires well is currently, as far as I'm concerned, a question mark. And that was something that I learned. That wasn't something I was happy to learn about. But particularly in Bonnie Doon, and it's interesting to start with the subject because it's one of the hottest topics that I found. We have homelessness. A lot of that's a city issue. Of course, it also relates to the county, especially in Live Oak and other areas. And the county should be, of course, properly dealing with it. It's their mandate to deal with the indigent. But the fire issue in Bonnie Doon, there is so much mistrust happening between the residents of Bonnie Doon, CAL FIRE, which is a state-level agency, which basically runs our county fire program. And so what that means is that we don't really have local control of our firefighting services for the unincorporated area. And so what that has created is a lot of question marks around who's in charge, and if there is another big fire like CZU, where do our fire trucks go? Because they are state CAL FIRE trucks, most of them. And so they will go to wherever the state needs them to go. They are not dedicated to our county. And on top of that, we are down 1,000 firefighters in the state. We're having a hard time hiring more. We had an inmate program where inmates were fighting fires, which had its pros and its cons. But because of the inmate release program, due to COVID and to, social justice issues, we've lost a lot of the inmate firefighting capacity as well. So I learned a lot about the local firefighters, how they feel. I talked to firefighters. I just drove up to the fire station on Swanton Road one day and hung out with the firefighters there for like an hour and a half.
Oh, yeah.
I talked with our new fire chief. His name is Nate Armstrong, who took over he was the deputy and took over from the last chief, who was the chief during the CZU complex fires. But there are residents of Bonnie Doon who are still feeling incredibly mistrustful, hurt, traumatized by the way that they say the CAL FIRE response happened to the CZU fires especially in Bonnie Doon. And so, there are people in Bonnie Doon, like with arms, who are ready to fight their own fires and will not allow CAL FIRE onto their properties. That's not everybody. It may just be 5% of the population. It may be more. It may be less. But there are some real question marks, and that the healing and the conversations and the dialogue that needs to happen around that has not happened. Mm-hmm. And we are down in terms of our capacity for volunteer firefighters. We are down in our statewide capacity, our CAL FIRE capacity. And I was told, and I'm not going to name names here, but by a very important fire official, that even the county supervisors don't really understand the county firefighting program. So there's a sense of there's no one really at the helm of this ship. And it's a very important ship, right, for our county.
Yeah, very. And I know a number of people who lost their homes personally, and most of those were in Bonnie Doon area. Yeah. And some of the stories, you don't know whether it's out for sure true or maybe it's true or
right.
But it sounds like it would have been great if there were just a little bit more planning, a little bit better resources, could have made a really big difference. Yeah. And I happen to own, for contrast, I happen to own a property in Nevada County, California. Okay. Where, for those who know where Grass Valley, Nevada City, and Truckee are all in Nevada County.
Yeah, I've been there.
And they have very aggressive fire prevention strategies, and they have very fast fire response. And I'm aware of, because I get, as a property owner, I get these text alerts when there's a fire. Yeah. I'm aware of half a dozen fires that have happened, within a couple miles of my property. Yeah. And every one of them was completely suppressed within a relatively short time. Even a fairly large one that burned, I believe it was last year in June of 2021, that they managed to get under control in 3 days. And it was I forget, 400 acres or something.
What county is that?
That's Nevada County.
Okay, so
And it isn't so much the county in that case, because almost the entire county is all CAL FIRE responsibility, but it is coordination, and the coordination is a big part of it, I think.
Yeah.
And it's also, I think, maybe heightened awareness to a certain degree. It's a very different climate there.
Yeah.
Because you're looking at pine forest, which is much more flammable, as anybody who's, who had property in Santa Cruz County that shared redwood trees and Doug fir. The Doug firs all died in the fire. A lot of the redwood trees came back. Well, pine forest is like the Doug fir. It just goes.
Yeah, they have a lot of sap and
Yeah, and when they get dry, they're really dry.
Well, so look, I just want to share also that there is a fire commission for the county that's supposed to be overseeing all of this, but my understanding, this is talking to all sides. When I talk to all sides and I get consensus, then I think, okay, that's got to be true, right? This commission is not really actively doing the job of overseeing what should be done with the fire program. And so what a lot of listeners may not know is that we have this contract with CAL FIRE because what is stated often is that we're saving a lot of money because CAL FIRE pays for the entire fire budget, something like 80% of the year under the Amador contract. That means that they're in charge of the whole budget during the fire season.
Wow.
And interestingly, I've heard from including supervisors saying different things about, well, we pay during the off season or we pay during the on season. This is how confusing it is, right? So, and It took me a while to get to the bottom of things, and I am not at the bottom of things. And that's something that I want to stress here is that, when you're running for office, you become a, dangerous enough, what's that phrase? Enough, you get to know enough to be dangerous, right? You learn enough to be dangerous. Because every single issue really deserves an in-depth, almost as a former journalist, investigative dive. Mm-hmm. We do have some good journalists in this community, and I started to pay way more attention to the journalists here when I was running for office. Kara Myberg Guzman occurs to me as someone who tries to go more in-depth into issues with Santa Cruz Local. And we need more of that kind of journalism because these are life and death issues. People are traumatized because they almost lost their lives. In some cases, they lost their homes. And I mean, there are many issues. Should people be living in the WUI, and how much responsibility should we have for them? And we can talk about all these things. But what I'm trying to express is that we need to talk about these things at a community level. And that's something that I've talked with you about in the past, Len, as someone who's also sort of a political activist in this community and cares about our community, that we need to learn how to get together in a room and have a real dialogue. Because when I talked to the fire chief, I didn't get the sense that he was a bad, evil person. And when I talked to the people in Bonnie Doon who were so upset, I didn't get the sense that they were bad, evil people, but there is so much mistrust. And there are different stories coming from different directions there for sure.
Yeah, and it's very hard to have a constructive dialogue until you do establish some level of trust.
Yes. There was an attempt to have a Zoom conference call that Nate Armstrong was on with Bonnie Doon residents. It became kind of like just a shouting match, and he started to refuse to answer questions, right? Because he felt that he couldn't really have a dialogue. And so you need to have dialogues where you have some preparation. People are even trained how to listen. You have some really good facilitation, and maybe it takes time. Maybe it takes a full day, Yeah. So anyway,
trained facilitators make a big difference.
They do, exactly. And we have a lot in this community. It's something that I wish our governments would pay more attention to, that we could have good facilitation of community meetings and deeper dialogues.
Yeah, and it seems like our elected officials would benefit from some of that training themselves.
Well, we all would.
Yeah, we all would. And there are times I've been at public meetings where I think, oh my goodness, that's like, group facilitation 101, and they just missed it completely. So
yeah.
Anyway, if you're just tuning in, my guest is Amy Chen-Mills. She recently ran for county supervisor, and she is a mental health professional and a climate and social justice activist. We were talking a bit about issues, and we got into fire, which is obviously a big one. And you
Yes.
mentioned there's an advisory commission dealing with fire for the county.
Yeah.
And that, you didn't get to the bottom of the issue, but you certainly made a wonderful effort at trying to get some understanding. There are a lot of other issues in the county, and of course related to the fire issue for the county is the difficulties a lot of people are having in getting through the county to get permits and to be able to reconstruct
Right.
homes who want to. But there's, the issues go on and on. The county's responsible for all the
Okay,
public
I'm
health
having flashbacks.
stuff, right?
I'm having post-trauma from the campaign. No, I'm
I'm
fine.
good at inducing trauma. I'm sorry.
No, this is good. Look, I can be honest now. I can be fully honest.
Yeah, and I appreciate, and I want to ask you later a little bit more about the experience of the campaigning itself.
Yeah.
But sticking for the moment with some of these issues that come up in the county, one of the things that comes up a lot is around homelessness.
Yes.
And related to that, housing.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you kind of, what was your experience? What did you find out? Who'd you talk to? And what was your sense of where where things are not quite working?
Yeah. Well, like everywhere. No, I think there are some good things happening. We have a new sort of homelessness czar at the county level. He seems like a very nice man. His name is Robert Ratner. And, there are still issues, and certainly at the city level, and it's an interplay between the city and the county, where the county was providing and does provide monies, for example, the Armory, to allow people to stay and shelter up near De La Viega Golf Course. And that is a National Guard property. The city is going to be taking that over, and that will then be city money. So there's this back and forth, and there's always been a problem of communication and coordination and who's in charge of what. And all of that, I think, is starting to improve and certainly could be more improved. But what you have housing issues that relate to a huge push from Sacramento to build, baby, build. And we're looking at that in the city with, possible 20-story buildings in the south of Laurel area. We're looking at that in terms of just a push to build in general, in the East Meadow of UCSC and so on and so forth. And so there's this group called YIMBY, Yes in My Backyard, that really comes out of the Silicon Valley community, looking for housing for Silicon Valley employees and people who normally would feel like they should be able to afford housing, who couldn't. So there's a little bit of entitlement, anger, and privilege there, and yet also a totally understandable, like, people should be able to live in housing. But what that's created, because there's so much money behind it, and for me, it's been hard to parse out, like, what is the reality of building market rate housing? Do we need more market rate housing versus what we're actually missing in the city? And this is according to the housing requirements that have been put upon us, is very low income and low income housing. So there's the YIMBY effort is just build housing, build as much housing as you can, build housing everywhere and approve housing. And at the same time, we're in the middle of a climate crisis where cement and concrete account for 10% of our greenhouse gases. And so I think this conversation is another one that needs more depth. Is it that we need to build more and more market rate housing? Or is it that we need to really just focus on working with nonprofit developers on public lands to provide workforce housing for our workforce, for people who live here, who cannot live here anymore, as well as permanent supportive housing to house the people who are currently unhoused in our community? And my own sense is that would have been my focus as a county supervisor. I'm always open to a discussion. But what was hard for me as a climate activist and someone who's very climate aware is to know that we are looking at, and this is Catherine Hayhoe, who's a very respected climate scientist out of Texas, in fact, who's spoken to Congress. I have been in the room with her as she has testified in Washington, D.C., in front of congressional members, including Jimmy Panetta. Our climate scientists are now saying we are looking at civilizational collapse. Okay, so unless we...
And there's there's a lot of elements to that. It's,
right.
It's water supply, it's food supply.
It's right.
It's public health.
Right.
Which is a whole other,
Right.
And it's all these factors that are caused or related to climate that are coming together.
Right. So that means that if nationally we are not doing enough, locally we have more power to control what we do here. We get to vote. We get to know who our county supervisor is. We get to meet with them almost on a regular basis if we want to, town hall meetings. We can do that with Jimmy Panetta, but, of course, it's a much larger, geographical area, the whole nation. And so how do we respond to the climate crisis? And I don't mean the rail trail. Okay, the rail trail will happen in 10 years or whatever or not. Even if it does happen, I've had people come up to me and say, oh, well, climate activists should just focus on, defeating Measure D. And I'm like, you don't understand what we're dealing with. We are dealing with within this decade. And we're already dealing with, I think, in terms of inflation and supply chain disruption and food crop failures. Mm-hmm. It's already happening. The climate crisis is affecting our food supplies. Mm-hmm. It's affecting huge amounts of acres of crops in different states where there have been, demon winds and, in Texas, the ice storms, for example, wiped out a lot of crops. And factories too, when they're flooded out, what happens to their manufacturing capacity, that's part of supply chain disruption. And I, for me, my whole platform was let's be reality based. And what I found is that a lot of people they're not ready to be reality based, or you have to lead them into being reality based. But most people are not reality based. And I include, centrist Democrats, both at the national level and local level. It's that we don't want to talk about these things. We need to be looking at our food security. We need to be moving everything as if we were on the Titanic and we were heading for an iceberg. That's the level of crisis that we're in. And that is when people talk about, oh, let's keep building. And my problem with YIMBY was I could not sort out the good intentions and the wonderful questions they had for us at the forum with the amount of money flowing in from realtors and developers. This is where the money for YIMBY is coming from. So when that much money is coming in, mm-hmm. how can you know what really good policy would be for people, especially people who don't have the voice that developers have and that wealthy people have, which is inordinate in our democracy and inordinate locally as well.
Yeah. And I've encountered people who say, well, I don't want affordable housing built because that just attracts those people,
right?
Basically indicating the homeless,
right?
Not realizing that what's defined as affordable in Santa Cruz County, is about $76,000, I believe. I may not have the exact right number, but it's in that order.
Yeah.
We're not talking about housing affordability for people who have no homes. We're talking about housing affordability for the average citizen.
Right.
You
mean $76,000 what?
That now qualifies as, if you earn under that, or under, then you now qualify for affordable housing, subsidized housing.
It's like a percentage of the average median income.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Just to avoid confusion on that topic.
Yeah.
When we talk affordable housing, we're talking about, a lot of people who are already working, have families, live somewhere, effectively being squeezed out.
Yeah.
Housing becoming so unaffordable that they have no choice. They either leave the area completely or they become homeless, which...
I talked to several people who were terrified. One grad student couple at UCSC who could not find a place to live, as I have been running for office, and at the end of the campaign, until the primary election, which is now over, I have a friend who has become unhoused and was evicted, could not find a place for $2,000 a month to live on her own. She was hoping to be on her own. She's in her 60s. And had to go buy an RV. Ended up on Delaware, and this is a major issue, right, with the oversized vehicle ordinance that the council majority has been trying to pass, and the camping ban. And it was terrifying. It was terrifying for her, because here's someone who works in the community. She's actually a housekeeper in the community. That's what she does, is clean houses. And she ended up in an RV on Schaefer and Delaware, trying so fearful that her RV would get towed, and in a situation where she's waiting for the pink slip to arrive. She doesn't have that. The registration is not up to date.
Wow.
Right? And so all these things make you vulnerable to towing and not being able to get your RV back.
Right.
And she would call me and be in tears and be so stressed out and say, look, people think that everyone down here is a drug addict and a ne'er-do-well and someone from out of town or someone committing crimes. And we could talk about what drug addiction means when you're unhoused, right? Because that isn't necessarily a crime. We have a lot of drug-addicted people living in homes. They might be addicted to the same kinds of drugs or different kinds of acceptable drugs, right?
Right.
She, her point was there are all kinds of people here, and we are all incredibly stressed out. There's no place to dump anything. There's no water. There's no electricity. And the city does not have that ready to go at all. So, in fact, I just found out that the 76 station that the city has been saying that's where you can go dump your black water and your gray water from your RV actually does not provide that service anymore. I am going to follow up on that, call them. And, when I put out my next newsletter, I will report back on that. I intend to continue to, I have a newsletter. You can sign up for it at amychen.com, AMICHEN.com, and I will be reporting on this campaign as we go forward and sharing my thoughts and feelings, because guess what? I'm not running anymore, so I get to say whatever I want. Not that I didn't on the campaign trail, but you do find yourself going, oh, I don't know. Is that a good idea? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
There's got to be a little... Yeah, you're trying to be strategic, as
right?
it were,
You're trying
when you're
to
running
be
for office.
Right.
If you're just joining us, my guest is Amy Chen-Mills. She was a candidate for county supervisor in the 3rd District. She's a mental health professional and a climate and social justice activist. And we're going to take a really short break, and we'll be right back. So don't go away. So I'm here with Amy Chen-Mills, and we've been talking about some of the county issues that she was exploring and talking about while running as a candidate. And one of the things, there's so many things that the county deals with, but one of the things that's come up recently, there's a recent grand jury report. And the grand jury has given the mandate of investigating issues in the county and seeing if things are managed well. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the grand jury report.
Which one?
Well, okay, I'll let you choose.
There are so many. There's one on homelessness. There's one from 2020 on the fires and fire prevention. There's a recent one on water, I believe, and there's been grand jury reports on the jails. And from my reading of some of these reports, and I can't say that I've read them all in depth, I think everybody probably should do, especially if you're interested in the topic. I met people who served on the grand juries, and I've known people who've served on the grand juries. People I was on the city homelessness committee with had served on the grand juries. And my sense about grand juries, and I've read about this nationally, is that often the reports come out and they are more or less ignored. Like, for example, the grand jury report on homelessness recommended, for example, using the juvenile hall property space to create some kind of housing for people who are homeless. And that's up on Graham Hill Road.
Yes.
And talked about, tiny home villages, went very in depth with a lot of these different proposals. But, as far as I know, these haven't moved forward. Now, there may be reasons for that. There may be, we tried and we failed. I talked to one of the supervisors who said, you can't actually use the juvenile hall property. I'm one of these people, and it's, I'm sorry, Santa Cruz County, but I would have been a good supervisor. Because people will say no to me, and I'll still figure out, like, how can we do it anyway?
Because the question is why.
Right.
And if the reason is, often the reason is something that you can work through.
Yeah.
It's you can't just say, take no on surface value.
Right. You have to push. And I've pushed before in administrative situations in Santa Clara County, where I worked for about 6 or 7 years in various departments. And I often find that if you have enough rapport, if you're sweet, if you're friendly, and if you're, if you keep and you're persistent, you can often get things done that a lot of people don't think you can get done. And now is the time we need the most creative, innovative solutions ever. Here's someone interesting. I talked to Ron Swenson, who is the owner of the property where the Homeless Garden Project currently exists, down at the end of Delaware, at Delaware and Schaefer. And he has these wonderful ideas for building some units there on that property for people who are unhoused. And, he said something that really struck me. He's a very kind-hearted person, clearly. I don't know how much he's charging the Homeless Garden Project, but he's not making as much money as some other developer could, which would be
Especially
millions.
if he developed it.
Yeah, exactly. And so, he said, we just need to start to experiment. We need to have this spirit of experimentation and innovation. And, this brings me back to one of our council members who was recalled, Drew Glover, and his spirit of innovation and experimentation around homelessness, which was met with, incredible negative pushback from some people in the community, but not everyone. And there were other issues. I've actually talked to him since then, and he seems to have had some personal insights about, and maybe he was on Chris Crone's show talking about about his own style of communication that was problematic. But it just feels like we don't even want to try. People complain about the benchlands. Well, here we've got the benchlands. Drew Glover was proposing that we actually set up a managed camp there during the Ross Camp time. And move people there and have it be structured and have it be something that we sort of actively, where we created a sense of community and so forth. And now we have something that is, they say it's kind of managed, it's partially managed. It's really just a big sprawling mess at this point. And there it is. It hasn't, This is the thing. We are not reality based. Homelessness is not going away. And I feel like a lot of times people are like, we just want to wish it away. Well, we can't. And so let's try things. And we could talk more about that, but I think that's what we need to do. And we need to use county lands to build housing for people who are unhoused and for our workforce and for our people who live here. I don't even like to say workforce because that makes everyone sound like a worker, and we're more than workers. We're humans. And we have ties here, and we are creative, and we are spiritual, and we are artistic, and we do lots of different things.
Yeah, and the city did a wonderful thing when they built the tannery complex, which now houses a whole lot of artists, and that was an experiment, you could say, that has turned out really well.
Yeah.
And I've lived in this community for almost 52 years.
Okay.
And there's always been people here who were without houses, but it has really changed, and especially in the last decade. And what I've found in talking to people who live outside is that most of them, used to have a job and a house. And most of them, even the ones who had a history of drug addiction, were, had gotten better, had got it under control, or had gotten completely clean and sober until they got homeless again.
Yeah.
And so what happens is you get this downward spiral where you're homeless for 3 months. You can come through that and get back into shape and everything's good. You're homeless for a year It's a lot harder. You're holding them for 5 years, it gets almost impossible.
Right.
And this is what we've been doing, is we've been creating a whole class of
Yes.
homeless people in the United States that's
And then when they
getting
when they-
compounding problems of mental illness from stress and
Oh my
addiction
gosh!
issues
No,
and
my
everything
my
else.
friend was telling me, and it was heartbreaking. And finally, I mean, thank goodness, and thank the good Lord, we found a place for her to be for a little while. It's not permanent, but it's for a little while with a bathroom, with a kitchen, no shower, but it's a property, right? And that's private, so she can't get towed away. But she was telling me, my hair is falling out. I don't know where to go to the bathroom. I think my sense is that if we could trust, at least for me, if I could trust our leaders to have a deep, and I felt this from the people I talked to at Housing Matters, for example, and I felt this from Robert Ratner also to some extent, the new housing, the Housing for Health czar at the county level, is I want to be talking to people who have this kind of deep empathy. It doesn't mean that we don't have to have some boundaries, that people can just commit crimes and be scary or whatever. And again, I want to say that people can be scary, whether they are in homes or not, right? That's not
Right.
a special function of people who are unhoused.
I can think of a few examples, which will go unnamed.
Yeah. Well, we've got the whole January 6th insurrection. Okay, that was a lot of scary people, And so I think, but there's a tendency to be very, very alarmed when it's an unhoused person, right? Okay, but still, let's say there are laws on the books. So how do we enforce the laws? And then it goes into the jails, and we should talk about the jails at some point. I think it's a fascinating subject, and I'm very grateful to Sheriff Hart for taking me on, like a 4-hour tour of the jails. I think I did talk about it a little bit here before,
Yeah.
but of course not everyone listens.
Yeah, and I'd like to have you talk about that, but I want to go back to you
Yeah.
mentioned in relation to the grand jury reports about water issues in the
Yeah,
county.
yeah.
And we have some major water issues
Yes,
in the
we
county.
do. Yes, we do.
And what are some of the ones that our listeners might be less aware of?
Well, we have water issues everywhere, and one of them, I mean, in terms of District 3 in Davenport, for example, people are paying a huge amount of money for water. And I had heard from talking to actually a county supervisor, I won't name names, that, it's been taken care of, or someone else said, it's not as expensive now, it's being fixed. But when I knocked on doors in Davenport, people were telling me they're paying almost $1,000 a month for their water. And that has to do with they're getting their water from a different source. It's a creek. It's a set of creeks and streams. I think it's like 2 that feed into one, and it gets to be a very complicated. So that's one issue. And they are not connected to the city system, where it's, since we have a mega system here, we get the benefit of, I guess, a bunch of people paying into the system. But then we also have saltwater intrusion, particularly in SoCal, and people may know about this or not, but because of climate change, we have groundwater, and, because of drought, leaving the underground aquifers. And so what's happening is the saltwater is coming in to fill the vacuum. That's called saltwater intrusion. And also sea levels are rising, so that also creates pressure. So the SoCal Water District has made an arrangement with the city of Santa Cruz to build pipes from the wastewater treatment facility, so that they're actually pumping recycled wastewater into their aquifers to keep the saltwater out. We have other issues in the San Lorenzo Valley where they are connected with Scotts Valley. They're sharing water resources, and it's very complicated. I'm not going to say that I remember this totally correctly, but essentially we need to be paying very close attention to both water and sharing water and being able to support each other in water, and making sure that our water supplies are adequate. San Lorenzo Valley had damage from the fires to its pipes, some of its plastic piping for the water. So now they're dealing with trying to recover from that. They need money for their agency to oversee just everything that needs to happen up there with water. And then also in the Pajaro Valley, we have saltwater intrusion all along the coastline where farmers can't use that water anymore. So they've actually, the Pajaro Valley Water District has created metering, and at first it was resisted by farmers and agricultural users, but people started to accept it as something we have to do, and that's been super, super helpful. These are all issues that we need to pay close attention to. People will say that if we add residents, especially in like apartment buildings, the water use isn't so much in terms of adding on to the problem. However, my concern is that we are now in an era of discontinuity. We can't count on anything to continue the way it has been.
Right.
And so, given that we are in an era of discontinuity, I think we need to be very careful about water. We need to be careful about adding students to UCSC. It's not just conservation. We're very good at conserving, but we also have these natural pressures. And I haven't had a chance to read that full water report that came out relatively recently from the grand jury, but did you read it, Len?
I did not. No.
Okay. Yeah. And there's some wonderful people that know a lot about water in our community that would be good to have, on the radio.
Yeah, and it's, water is life. It is such an absolutely critical service for all of us.
Yes.
And we tend to take it for granted.
Yeah.
Except maybe on the day you pay your bill.
Yeah. Well, I want to speak to one thing that before I forget, because I know we're going to run out of time at some point, which is that one thing that one shared value, I heard Fred Keeley say this on the radio, and I said, yeah, that's a good way to put it. There's one shared value that we do have, and that was across candidates and different groups that were pressuring us to take on their positions, right? And that is infill development. I think we all can agree that we want to see infill development along transportation corridors. That's been a consistent theme. Mm-hmm. Also, mixed-use development outside of urban centers for us. Like, for example, anywhere on the west side, I live on the west side, adding in more apartment buildings, adding in more duplexes. And some of this is now almost mandated by the state. So I think we agree on that we can build more housing. That's fine. But we have to be careful, and there are people in the community who believe that most of our issues are affordability issues. It's not a matter of building more housing necessarily. Mm-hmm. And other people who think we must build. That's the area we need to really look into and dive into from a policy perspective and take the money out of the system while we're looking at that, because we are dealing with the climate crisis at the same time.
Yeah, which is huge.
Yeah, and species extinction as well.
Right, and so that relates to habitat, which is about not expanding the urbanized area, but
exactly
getting the urbanized area to work better.
Yeah,
and I have a planning background, and there's kind of a myth that in order for it to work, you have to have high density. Yes, but what do you mean by high density? Well, it turns out that what works perfectly good are 2- and 3-story townhouses. That's high density compared to single family houses on a fifth of an acre lot. Mm-hmm. It's, if you have, common wall townhouses that are 2 or 3 stories high, you've got sufficient density to support mixed uses, walkable neighborhoods.
Families.
And you can design for that.
Yeah.
We don't need to have 20-story buildings. It doesn't have to be only 2 or 3, but we certainly don't need 10-story and 20-story buildings to be considered adequate density for public transit to really work, for infrastructure to be affordable.
I know. How do we go from...
It's just a myth that gets around,
Yeah, exactly.
That's what we have to have is all these giant,
huge
like downtown
buildings,
San Francisco.
And then
not true.
Exactly. And the thing is, why did we all decide to live here? There's a certain quality of life. Why is there pressure? Why are people moving here? And there is growth in the city, but not in the county and not in the state. Right? There isn't growth in the state.
Right.
Where there's population loss, and also throughout most of the county there isn't growth. It's very specific to Santa Cruz, which I think added like 6,000 people, and I don't know if that's coming from the university or where. We should find out. But it's like we don't need to have these different crises, a housing crisis. It's actually also a neoliberal capitalist late stage capitalist crisis, right? Really. And then also the climate crisis. We should not allow them to be in conflict in terms of our solutions. I think we're better than that. I think we're more creative and imaginative, and we can figure out how to get things done without decimating species. And we need all the species we can get. We're losing, according to World Wildlife Fund, 200 species a day right now. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
So, if you're just tuning in, my guest is Amy Chen-Mills, and she was a candidate for 3rd District Supervisor. She's a mental health professional and a climate and social justice activist. So we only have 10 minutes left, and I wanted to give you a chance to, because I want to hear about it, your experience of deciding to run for office and running for office. How did you arrive at that decision, and what was it like?
Well, I've always been a kind of a public speaker. I've always, since I'd say 2016, I've been super engaged in national level politics, climate crisis issues, and being an activist around those issues. I also was very involved in the homelessness issue with the City Committee on Homelessness. And so I had thought about running for office. I thought about the city council. I feel like the city council does not get paid enough. And I think that's an equity issue. I'm not talking about myself personally, but I do think that people should get paid for their time. And and I've heard people say in this radio studio, who've been former mayors, it's an honor and a privilege to serve on the city council. What that means is that if you're wealthy, you can serve on the city council, or you can try to serve and hold down another job or 2 other jobs at the same time.
Right.
And it's really, if you are, especially if you have a majority on the council, it's really a full-time job. And with the crises that are facing us, I think that the city should get paid more. Of course, we have sort of a fiscal crisis at the city level. So anyway, I wasn't interested in running for council. I also felt the council was pretty dysfunctional, having observed it for some time. And then people came to me, and I wasn't even thinking, I wasn't plotting, there was no position in mind when the supervisor race opened up, because Coonerty was leaving. Shebra jumped in and Justin jumped in, and I thought, well, that seems like a pretty full race already. And then people came to me and said, look, there's a primary. We're interested in you running. We're interested in supporting you. And I said, why? And they said, because we haven't seen the kind of really climate leadership that we would like to see. And I felt that way too about the city council, about both my candidates and other people who've been in the council. And even at the county level, we need people who are willing to, what's the word? You know how they say speak truth to power, speak truth to their constituency. You know, and I've had supervisors tell me you can't run on climate. Well, that's because it's a downer, right? But if you are going to ignore it, then you're not building good policy, because you're not building policy based on reality. And so rail trail. Okay, great idea. And like I say, in 10 years, we're going to be dealing probably with, if we don't dramatically change course, already a certain amount of civilizational collapse, which we're seeing. I mean, when you lose 900 homes in a fire, that's a certain kind of collapse, right? And that's happening all over the state. When you have like whole areas of the country flooded out, that's impacting supply chains. That's not getting better, people. So what I'm really interested in now is localism, which is, and you can check my Facebook page. I posted a video on Vimeo. I didn't make it. Someone shared it with me on localism, which is about what can we do to care for the ground, the earth that we live on, that we stand on. And that would be, how do we switch to regenerative agriculture? How do we make sure we have enough food growing locally to support our population? How do we support very local businesses and very local economies? And even divest ourselves from the globalist neo-capitalist system, which actually I think a lot of Republicans and conservative people are fed up with just as much.
Yeah, at least.
Yes.
Yeah.
So how do we take care of each other and become more really locally community focused, and that was something I wanted to do as supervisor. So that was my thinking, jumping into the race. And we knew it was going to be a long shot because we jumped in 4 months after the other two candidates. So we didn't have as much time to raise funds. We didn't have as much time to walk precincts or to get the word out or to get my name out. And the other two have more name recognition. But we felt it was important to bring up the issues and to put them out there and to push the other candidates. And I want to share that one of my team members, Jane Weed Pomerantz, who was a former mayor also of our city, has said something in our last meeting. She said, we were a campaign of issues that happened to support a candidate.
Right.
And that's how we should see things, as a community, there are these issues we care about. It doesn't matter if I win or lose or what happens for me. I mean, it'd be nice to win, to promote what I care about, but we should all be caring and we should all be influencing each other, and we should continue these conversations with one another. And I have invited Justin, and we've met once, and I'm hoping that Shebra will also meet with me to talk about these very important issues that face us, because it's a very, very challenging, difficult time. And for many people, it's a life or death situation, whether that's housing and homelessness, whether that's the global climate crisis, which has already become a life and death situation for us, right? When there's a fire. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then there you were.
Yes.
You're attending candidate forums.
Yes.
You're going door to door in some neighborhoods.
Yes.
You're being talked to by the press and so
Yes.
forth. And
A little bit.
And you're trying to raise
being
money to
talked
keep
to.
it all going, right?
Yes.
So where did you, how did it feel? Did you have difficulty in trying to integrate all of that?
Well, I mean, luckily, I'm a good person for this job. I'm a journalist, so I can do research very quickly. And I think I can separate the wheat from the chaff. I'm also a person who likes human beings. I like meeting people. I like listening to people. There certainly was a learning curve. But I did find that in terms of my knowledge of the issues, I was on par with the other two candidates. They're both council members, but in terms of county level stuff, we were all learning very quickly.
Right.
I tell people it's the second hardest thing I've ever done in my life. I won't name the first hardest thing because it's personal. The third hardest thing was childbirth. So
harder than childbirth.
Yeah, harder than childbirth because it's 24/7. It's constant. Mm-hmm. It's because you feel indebted to your team. Your team is rooting for you. They are putting out so much effort and work for free. And you're all putting in all your blood, sweat, and tears. You know what I'm saying? So I felt very responsible to my team, to the people who were supporting me, to the people who came to my door with a check saying, I just care so much about the climate, and I believe that you are not corrupted by anything or buddy or money or whatever. So, yeah, and I do want to say that I think, because I'm someone who likes to innovate, I always look at things and I'm thinking, how can we do something better? The forums themselves, they're very, people talk about colonialism and the colonial mindset and colonization. That's what it feels like to me, is that we've created a system that is very, you get 2 minutes and you get 2 minutes, and there's no room for how do we have a deeper conversation about this? What if there's a follow-up question? What if, and so there's got to be a better way than these forums where we get sometimes 1 minute to answer a question.
Right.
How
over
deep
an issue that
I know, on homelessness or the climate crisis, right?
Yeah.
It just
or
makes,
water security.
Yeah.
Or
So
1 minute, no problem.
And so we were all frustrated by that, and I think, and then I had some groups that I'm trying to think. I think it was the DCC, and then also this other group that I'm forgetting the name of them. They work with housing and homelessness issues. They had a big forum in a church later, but before the forums, we met and we did an interview, and it was a conversation, and it was a dialogue, and so we got to know each other. And I got to know them, they got to know me.
Trust.
And that was, those were two contexts that I felt were useful and productive.
Great.
And
well, we have 1 minute
Okay.
left.
Yeah.
And I really first want to thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And want to continue this discussion in some form.
Yeah.
But just give you a chance to say a few words further about the experience and what you would like our listeners to take away from this conversation.
Well, what I'd like our listeners to take away is that I really ran because I care so much. And I'm hoping that in my meetings with the 2 other candidates, they get that sense from me as well. It's not about winning or losing for me. It wasn't about the position or the money. The position itself seemed very, very actually difficult and challenging. It's a full-time job, and plus. And so I would also just say, please think about running for city council. There are going to be at least 2 seats up. And 2 people now tipping their hat into the mayor's race, but I think we need more. Think about it. It's not impossible. If I did it, probably you could do it too.
Great. Amy Chen-Mills, it's been a real pleasure, and thank you for your work in the community and for being here on Talk of the Bay.
Thank you so much, Len.